Hello, my friend. Today I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins in the deep stillness before the storm. When the wind held its breath and the sky seemed cloaked in the morning veil of twilight, the land of Mordor stirred with uneasy silence. The fires of Mount Doom, ever burning, cast long shadows across the blackened plains of Gorgoroth, where once armies had marched like thunder, and the air itself trembled beneath their tread. Now only the hiss of steam and the whisper of ash remained, as if the world was holding on to a final exhale. High above the ashen fields rose Barad-dûr, the dark tower, a monument of shadow carved by will and cruelty, standing like a wound upon the earth. It was a citadel of despair, its foundations older than the kingdoms of men, its spires spearing the clouds like jagged blades. No bird flew near it. No song touched its walls. Only the eye, lidless and wreathed in flame, watched tirelessly from its crown, until even that gaze began to falter, ever so slightly, flickering like a candle before the wind. Within the tower's heart, deep behind walls of obsidian and iron, there walked a figure cloaked not only in cloth, but in silence and memory. He was known now only as the Lieutenant, one of the Mouths of Sauron, though once long ago he had borne another name beneath the sun. His face was hidden behind a helm of black steel, but his eyes, if they could still be called that, burned with a cold and ancient fire, and though he moved with purpose, his heart was not still, for something strange had begun to awaken in him. Something long thought dead. The lieutenant stood before the Palantir, the seeing stone that once brought him glory and now brought him only anguish. Images flared within its depths. The banners of Gondor and Rohan gathered on the plains of the Morannon, their captains resolute, their soldiers defiant. He saw the white wizard, Gandalf the Grey, now clad in white, and beside him a man crowned not by lineage alone, but by destiny. Elisar, the hidden heir of Isildur, and beside him the elf, the dwarf, and the halflings, small figures, yet strangely bright in the gloom. The lieutenant's hand, encased in gauntlet, hovered above the stone. He did not touch it, not yet. He turned away, moving to the window where no true light ever entered, only the dull red of Mount Doom's breath. There he stood, for a long while, listening, not to sounds none could reach so high, so deep within the tower, but to thoughts, to the echo of a voice that was not his master's, nor his own, but something older, something buried. He remembered white sails upon the sea. He remembered the stars of Númenórean, high and bright above the silver shores of Anduin. He remembered a name spoken in gentleness. Calamel, that was her name, and he had loved her once, before the gift of long life became a curse, before the shadow fell and pride built the first stones of his ruin. But the past was a broken mirror now, each shard cutting deeper as he looked. That was the price of serving the eye, to forget all else, to live only in the now, in the burning, in the dark. And yet the past returned, unbidden. The tower groaned around him, as if it too were weary of its own existence. Below, in the forges and dungeons, the remaining servants of Sauron moved like ants without a queen, unsure, unraveled. The eye had begun to fail, though none dared say. There were whispers in the stone, tremors in the flame. Something had changed. The lieutenant descended into the lower halls, each step echoing like the toll of some ancient bell. He passed great doors sealed by sorcery, chambers where screams still lingered in the walls, and vaults filled with relics twisted by malice. He passed the bones of oaths broken, and the chains of kings forgotten. And all the while the presence that once filled every corner of the tower with terror seemed thinner. Less sure, he reached the great hall where the black throne stood. Sauron had never sat upon it, for he needed no such symbol. His will alone was throne enough. But now it stood empty, draped in cobwebs, spun not by spiders, but by the silence of fear unmet. The hall felt abandoned, though filled with servants. Each orc, each troll, each wraith or shadowed beast paused when the lieutenant passed, as if sensing the weight of questions in his stride. At the foot of the throne he knelt, not in worship, but in weariness. He did not speak. There was no need. The eye watched, ever watching, but it no longer seared the soul as once it did. The lieutenant could feel it diminished, distracted, and far away. In lands unseen by stone or spell, a hobbit crept through ash and ruin, bearing a weight far heavier than the crown of any king. The lieutenant rose slowly. He had not knelt in many years. His armor creaked with the motion like a tree grown too old to bend. He looked once more at the throne, then turned, his thoughts unspoken, but not still. There was a storm gathering beyond the Moran. He had seen it. He had felt it. Not of wind and rain, but of hope, of defiance. And he who had once knelt before the valor in reverence now stood before the fall of Barad-dûr and did not know what choice to make. For the first time in an age, a sliver of doubt pierced the darkness in his heart. A sliver of light. And far below the tower, unnoticed by most, a single crack split the obsidian floor. Small, silent, but spreading. The end had not yet come, but it had begun. The wind began to rise that night, not as a storm, but as a lament, weaving through the broken teeth of the Ephel-Duath with a voice like mourning. It hissed down the tower's black walls and coiled around the battlements like a serpent that had lost its warmth, slithering between towers and bridges, stirring dust that had not moved in years. The tower responded with low groans, as though it too could feel the change, the nearing of some inevitable unraveling. High above, the eye still flared and dimmed in irregular pulses, no longer a beacon of dominion, but the flickering heartbeat of a wounded god. In a chamber of darkened glass and carved basil, the lieutenant stood once more before the palantir, his armored hand resting near it, but not upon it, as though he feared the touch might burn him now. His reflection, cast faintly in the polished floor beneath him, looked like a man drowning beneath dark water, distorted, unwhole, and too far gone to reach. The stone pulsed with its own breathless urgency, revealing again the gathering of the free peoples beyond the Black Gate. Yet the images no longer came with the absolute clarity of a sovereign gaze. They shimmered, cracked, twisted, as if the stone itself could no longer bear the strain of a will unraveling. They come with torches held high, he murmured to himself, his voice dry as forgotten parchment and echoing faintly in the stone. They come with hearts of flame, and though they are few, the light in them is a terrible thing. He paused as if uncertain whether he had spoken aloud or merely thought it. The silence answered him, heavy and thick, pressing in like the deep sea, smothering sound and breath alike. He turned away from the palantir and paced the room, slow as the sweep of time. The walls here were engraved with ancient runes, the kind that drank light and never gave it back, remnants of a craft long outlawed by the valor. They pulsed faintly now, responding to some unseen rhythm, or perhaps the slow unraveling of the power that sustained them. And the lieutenant, once a captain in the host of Númenórean, once a scholar of the stars, paused to lay his hand against the tower remembers, he whispered, eyes unfocused. It remembers what it was before it became a prison. It remembers the stars. His fingers trembled slightly, the gauntlet clicking softly against the black stone. And I remember the wind over the sea of rune. I remember the laughter of my brother when we first saw the white tree bloom in the courts of Armenel. I remember my father's hands, rough with salt and rope, lifting me into the rigging of a Númenórean ship and saying, "The sea does not lie. It tells the truth the land hide." He laughed then, softly, the sound echoing oddly in the room, as if even that was a language this place had forgotten. "But I lied, didn't I?" he asked. "The stone, the tower, the shadows. I gave myself to a master who had no voice, only command. I silenced my own truths, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but obedience and fear masquerading as will." A knock came at the heavy door, more a rumble than a knock, as no hand in this place was gentle. A black armored orc stood beyond it, his face etched with weariness and confusion. The creature bowed, not from respect, but from habit, trained by centuries of terror. "My lord," it said, voice, the captains gather in the southern wall tower. They await orders." "Orders," the lieutenant said, the word bitter as ash. "Yes, that is what I am now. Is it not a dispenser of commands to those who do not understand the war has already been lost?" The orc blinked, uncertain, uneasy. "Shall I inform them, my—" "Tell them to hold their positions," the lieutenant said after a long silence. "Tell them to watch the gates and wait. Wait as stone waits for time to wear it to dust." The orc hesitated, perhaps sensing the deeper meaning. Then, bowing once more, it turned and vanished into the gloom. When the door closed again, the lieutenant returned to the window. The wind had risen further now, and the distant mountain glowed red with the veins of its wrath. Yet even the fire seemed subdued, reluctant, as though it too had begun to sense the unraveling. The sky had taken on a strange color, neither night nor dusk, but something in between, a pallid bruising that spoke of transitions that could not be named. Rested both hands on the sill and leaned forward as if seeking something in the air, something that might reach him beyond the reach of stone or shadow. "Calamel," he whispered, and the name hurt his throat. If there is still memory in the world, if the stars remember what it is to weep, then perhaps when this tower falls, they will carry my soul upon the wind, past the lands of ruin, past the fields of Pelennor, past even the light of Athlon, and into the west where no shadow falls. And the wind, rising still, slipped through the narrow slits of the window and brushed against the bare flesh beneath his helm, cold and strange, as though it had come from some far-off, older place, a place where towers were not prisons and hearts were not chained to rings of power. He did not speak again, not for a long while, but far below across the desolation, The banners of the west were being unfurled, and the ground where the orcs made ready in confusion and fury began to tremble, not from the march of feet, but from something deeper, as though the very bones of Middle-earth had begun to stir. The plains of Gorgoth stretched beneath the tower like a sea of cinders, each black stone and jagged ridge a frozen wave in a tide of ruin, and the wind that passed over them was thick with the scent of sulfur and sorrow, the very breath of Mordor, a place where the sun came only as a mockery, casting no warmth, only the illusion of light. The lieutenant descended slowly from his high chamber, the heels of his boots ringing hollow against the spiral stairs, their echo lost to the vast hollows of Barad-dûr's spine. These were not the halls of kings or lords or scholars. Though once, long ago, the stones had been laid with hands that knew both craft and vision. Now they were husks, their purpose twisted like a song rewritten in the tongue of nightmares. Below, in the chamber of the iron gates, the captains of the Black Host waited, a gathering of orcs, trolls, and fell spirits clad in war plate and desperation. Their snarls were quiet now, their bravado muted not by fear of the enemy, but by something far stranger, a disk in the bones, a premonition they did not understand. For though their eyes saw only the empty plains and the gate beyond still stood closed, they could feel the approach of something immense and invisible, like the hush before a great wave crashes upon a shore. And when the lieutenant entered, cloaked in the mantle of silence that had grown around him like moss over forgotten stone, the gathering parted, not from reverence, but because something in him now repelled them, as if his soul burned with a fire they could not touch without being unmade. He stood before them, and for a long time he said nothing. The great hall groaned beneath the weight of the tower above, as though even the stones feared collapse. A dim torch sputtered against a wall, its flame shivering in an unseen draught that whispered of old secrets. The lieutenant's helm, wrought in the fashion of Númenórean warlords of old, caught the light and reflected it in crimson as though blood wept from its iron brow. Then he spoke, and his voice was not loud, but it carried like the tolling of a distant bell in a dead land. "Do you feel it?" he asked, and his words lingered in the air like mist over grave soil. There is a silence in this place that is not the silence of stillness. It is the silence of a breath not taken, of a question not yet asked, but known by all. You do not speak it aloud, not because you do not know it, but because you fear the answer. The orcs shifted uneasily, and one, a larger beast with a helm made of jagged bone, grunted and said, "What are we waiting for? The enemy comes. Let us spill their blood, make them regret ever crossing the Black Lands." And the lieutenant turned slowly toward him, his gaze invisible beneath the visor, but his presence unmistakable. "Blood," he repeated, almost gently. "Yes, you crave it, because it is the only thing you have ever known to offer in return for fear. But blood does not answer what has begun to stir beneath our feet. Blood does not steal the quaking of stone, nor does it mend the cracks that now crawl through the bones of this tower. Blood does not stop the unraveling of fate." The orc sneered, confused, his fingers twitching at the hilt of his cruel blade. "Speak plain, Shadow Lord. What is it we face?" And for the first time, the lieutenant removed his helm slowly, deliberately, as though peeling away a mask long fused to his skin. His face, revealed, was pale, not with the power of death, but with the absence of light, as though his flesh had forgotten the sun. His eyes, gray once like the sea, had taken on the color of storm sky before a deluge. His voice, now unfiltered, was softer and yet deeper still. "We face the end of a lie," he said. "We face the moment when the wheel, long spun by fear and pride and power, begins to crack beneath the weight of truth. You see an army. I see a distraction. You see men and elves and dwarves and halflings gathered to break the gates. But I have seen what stirs beyond their blades. I have seen the fire that does not burn, the light that walks unseen, the courage that carries no banner but leaves ruin in its wake. I have seen the one who bears the weight we dare not name." He stepped closer to the gathered host, and the torches seemed to bend toward him, as if drawn by the gravity of revelation. "You were bred for war, but I was not. I was forged in a different age, when the stars still guided ships and the sea still spoke to the hearts of men. I came to this land seeking knowledge, seeking to protect, to build, to preserve. And instead, I traded wonder for control, traded all for dominion. I became a hollow vessel for the will of another. And in doing so, I forgot my name. And now, in the hour when all things are tested, I find that name calling back to me, not as memory, but as judgment." He turned from them then, not dismissing them, but as one who has said all that can be said. The hall remained still. No order was given. None needed to be. The captains, confused and unnerved, faded back into the shadows, each sensing that this was no longer a war in which their blades mattered. This was a reckoning. And so the lieutenant walked alone once more, his thoughts heavy as the stones that trembled around him. Outside, the sky wept ash instead of rain, and the eye above faltered again, a brief dimming that rippled across the land like a shiver down a dying spine. A silence deeper than the grave took hold of Barad-dûr, and in its hollow heart one man stood between memory and oblivion, wondering whether redemption could still be found in a place built upon forgetting. Far away across the plain, the wind stirred banners of white and green and silver, and the captains of the West looked toward the gates, not as conquerors, but as those who place their hope not in victory, but in sacrifice. And beneath it all, unseen but inexorable, the world itself turned toward the moment where choice would shape the fate of all things. The plains beyond the Númenórean were no longer empty. Where once the desolation of Gorgoth stretched like a wound across the land, black and lifeless, now there gathered a trembling defiance. Tattered banners raised high, not with the pomp of conquest, but with the solemn grace of those who marched to their deaths willingly. Their eyes fixed not on victory, but on meaning. The armies of the West had come, a fragile light flickering against a darkness that had claimed dominion for an age, and the wind carried with it not the scent of hope, not quite, but of something deeper, resolve that had outlived despair. It was a GG wind that whispered through the broken rocks and the ridged bones of the land, rustling cloaks and stirring ashes. GG, a wind that seemed to ask, "Do you remember what it was to believe?" And for a moment, beneath the looming blackness of Mordor's gaze, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. Within Barad-dûr, the lieutenant walked the hollow causeways that led to the summit, where the eye had once burned without end. Each step echoed like a heartbeat within a coffin, reverberating down corridors lined with obsidian statues, figures that had no names, no stories, only the faceless cruelty of those who had surrendered identity for the mask of power. And as he walked, the tower breathed around him, not with life, but with the slow, crumbling weaves of something ancient and dying, like the last murmurs of a forgotten god. The wind touched him even here, cold fingers slipping through the cracks of the tower's height, and he paused beside a great aperture where the walls had fractured. Through it he could see the shimmer of spears and the gleam of silver helms far below. So small they could have been mistaken for insects, were it not for the way they shone, not with the garish fire of domination, but with the quiet steadiness of souls who had chosen to stand in the mouth of death. Not because they believed they would win, but because they believed it was right. And the lieutenant, once a mariner of Númenórean, once a student of the stars and lover of poetry, felt something move within him. Not pain, not yet sorrow, but a shifting like ice breaking upon a lake long frozen. He did not speak for a time, but when he did, it was to the wind itself. "They do not come for conquest," he said, his voice low, uneven, almost reverent. "They do not come as the hosts of Aragorn did, bearing arrogance beneath their gilded armor. They come with songs buried in their blood, with grief in their hands. And yet they raise those hands, not to seize, but to offer. Do you see them? I do. You understand what it means? This final offering of themselves to the flame, not to destroy, but to shield what cannot defend itself. That is power. Not your kind, but a deeper one. The kind that builds rather than consume, that remembers rather than erases." He gripped the stone frame of the aperture, feeling the cold seep into his bones, as though the tower itself sought to reclaim him, to remind him of the oath he had taken. But that oath sworn in the shadow of the Palantir and bound by pride now felt like rusted chains clinging to a corpse. He spoke again, slower now, not to the wind, but to himself, as if the words needed to be shaped aloud to become real. "When we left Númenórean, we believed we were bringing civilization to a savage world. We believed that order was the highest virtue, that to impose it, even through fear, was to uplift the lesser races. That was the root of our pride, the belief that wisdom could only descend from the heights, never rise from the earth. And I swallowed that lie as one drinks bitter wine because it burned, and the burn felt like purpose." The wind moaned through the gap, and in its keening he imagined the voice of Calamel, her song once so bright it made the very stars seem to pause and listen. He had left her not with words of love or farewell, but with promises of greatness, of towers and glory, and a name that would never be forgotten. And in chasing that name, he had lost everything that made it worth remembering. The eye pulsed above him then, its flame dimming for a heartbeat, and he turned his gaze upward toward the summit where the will of Sauron still lingered, weak but clinging, a presence vast and formless, like the echo of thunder that will not fade. And from above a voice came, not sound, but thought, deep and cruel and cold as the void between stars. It reached into his mind like claws through silk, raking through his memories, his doubts. "Why do you hesitate, servant? The hour of reckoning is at hand. The enemy gathers their flesh soft, their minds fractured. Strike now, and you shall be remade in the image of my victory. All that you were can be buried. All that you are can be forged anew. But the lieutenant did not. Not this time. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids he saw not the burning eye, but a white tree swaying in a sea breeze, its petals caught in the air like snowflakes, like ash, like time itself come undone. "No," he whispered, "I have been forged once already, and in that forging I was broken. You offer fire without warmth, darkness without rest. I see now what I could not before, that to serve you is to forget, to surrender not only will, but soul. And I have remembered too much." There was silence then, and in it the tower trembled. Not a quake, not a shudder, but a sigh, deep and low, as if Barad itself had listened and understood. The wind outside grew stronger. The banners of the west danced more boldly now, and upon a nearby rise a figure stood tall. A man cloaked in shadow and starlight, with a sword that gleamed like the first light of dawn. And far away in the choking dark of Mount Doom, two small hands clutched at the edge of fate. The eye faltered. The lieutenant turned from the broken window and began to climb. He climbed, and with every step upward, the air grew thinner, colder, not merely in temperature, but in spirit, as though each stair drew him farther from the realm of the living and deeper into the marrow of memory, into that place where thoughts are no longer framed in words, but in sensations, echoes, and regrets too vast to name. The stairs spiraled endlessly around the inner skin of the tower, cut directly into the obsidian, their surfaces worn smooth by ages of silence and solitude. No torches burned here. The light was a dim crimson seepage from cracks in the stone, as if the tower itself bled slowly from its heart, a pulsing wound held together by the last tethers of Sauron's will. The walls closed in like ribs around him, a vast black cage, and the higher he climbed, the more the tower seemed to tum, not with power, but with fatigue, as though it resented his ascent, feared it, or perhaps knew it to be the herald of its unmaking. And the lieutenant, whose name had long been buried beneath titles and deeds he no longer wished to claim, ascended not with the stride of a conqueror, nor with the certainty of a priest drawing near to his altar, but with the weight of a man approaching a reckoning, a pilgrim not to holiness, but to the collapse of his own illusion. Each step struck a chord within the stone, and it seemed to him that the sound was not mere echo, but response, as if the tower were asking, "Why now, after all these years, after all the blood and ruin? Why choose remembrance when oblivion is so much easier to bear?" He reached a landing, if it could be called that, little more than a ledge where one might rest before the final climb. And here he paused, pressing a gauntleted hand to the wall. It was warm, not the warmth of hearth or sun, but the sickly heat of a dying forge, of something once fierce and burning, now collapsing under its own ambition. Beneath his fingers he felt the tremor again, not strong, not urgent, but steady, rhythmic, the heartbeat of a giant that had not yet died, but was no longer alive. He wondered if this was what a god felt like when its worshippers dwindled to none. Then, as though drawn from the very stone, a voice spoke, one he had not heard in many years. It was not the thunderous pressure of the eye, nor the snarling bark of captains and lieutenants long perished, but soft, clear, and hauntingly human. "You still seek the top," it said, and the voice was feminine, lilting with sorrow, like the last notes of a harp played in a ruined hall. "Even now you climb, not for power, but for meaning. And yet, what meaning can there be in ruin?" He did not answer at first. He closed his eyes, and the voice washed over him like the scent of rain upon dry stone, awakening things within him he had thought turned to dust. "Calamel," he whispered, his lips barely moving. "Even your memory is a flame that burns cleaner than all the fires in the place." A silence followed, heavy but not empty. Then the voice replied, softer than before. "You traded love for the illusion of permanence. You gave up the one thing that might have made your life eternal, not through dominion or fear, but through gentleness. You wanted the world to remember your name, and so you destroyed the part of yourself that could have been truly remembered." He bowed his head, resting it against the stone. "I believed," he murmured, "that if I could only outlast time, I would find peace. That if I stood in the highest place, if I became the voice that thundered in men's ears, that I would no longer be haunted by the silence within myself. But the higher I climbed, the less I could hear my own heart, until only the voice of my master remained, and even that I now see was only a reflection of my own hunger." The wall was silent now. The warmth beneath his hand faded slowly, leaving behind only the cold smoothness of obsidian. He stepped back, drawing breath like one who had emerged from deep water, and turned to face the final flight of stairs. Above him the summit awaited, a place where the eye had been fixed to its pillar of flame, where the will of Sauron had once focused its endless gaze across the lands of Middle-earth. But now the light flickered like a candle in a dying wind, and the stair itself trembled faintly beneath his weight. Every step felt fragile, as though the tower resented being touched by one who no longer believed in its creed. The walls here were smooth, unadorned, as if even Sauron had understood that at the peak of all ambition there must be simplicity, a blankness to reflect back the will of the master, unchallenged by beauty or story. He reached the summit. The chamber at the top was open to the air, or what passed for air in Mordor. A swirling darkness tinged with smoke and ash, lit in the sullen glow of Mount Doom like the last breath of a dying world, and in its howling he heard not voices, but the raw howl of endings, of things long suppressed, now crying out for release. And there, at the center of the chamber, stood the black pedestal upon which the eye had once flared, now reduced to a dim ember, a red pupil that blinked slowly, as if uncertain whether it still had reason to watch. He approached it slowly, his steps echoing into the void, and the eye looked at him, not with hatred, not even with command, but with fear. He stood before it, and for the first time he spoke not as a servant, nor as a traitor, but as a man who had seen the horizon from both ends of the earth, and come to understand that dominion was not the answer to sorrow. "I gave you everything," he said, his voice low but unshaking, "not out of loyalty, not out of love, but out of emptiness. I let you fill me because I did not know how to carry my own name. I thought myself unworthy of the stars, and so I built towers to block them out." The eye trembled. The flame within it flickered violently. "But I remember now," he continued, his hand reaching toward the pedestal, not in defiance, but in farewell. "I remember the light on the sails. I remember the voice that sang my name, not as a command, but as a blessing. And I remember that I was never meant to rule, nor to follow, but to witness, to preserve, to carry the stories of those who came before, and leave behind not ashes, but echo." And then, with a motion that was neither violent nor dramatic, he laid his palm upon the stone. The eye flared once, bright and wild, like a final cry, and then, without scream or shatter, it faded, and Barad-dûr shook, not as before, not in warning, but in surrender. It began not with fire, not with a roar, nor with the clanging of collapse, but with a silence so profound it felt as though the very bones of the world had ceased their whispering, as if time itself had drawn in a slow and terrible breath. The pedestal beneath the lieutenant's hand pulsed once more, no longer with defiance, nor with domination, but with something brittle and unfamiliar, like the shuddering final heartbeat of a dying beast that does not yet understand it has been slain. And then, almost imperceptibly, the obsidian beneath his palm cracked, a hairline fracture etched with a whispering hiss that echoed through the vast, hollow tower like the sound of memory breaking open after long suppression. He stepped back slowly, not out of fear, but reverence, as though he stood at the threshold of some sacred funeral pie, one not built for a man or a king, but for an age. The chamber shuddered again, and from the walls came a long groan, not violent, not abrupt, but weary, like an old tree bowing under the weight of too many winters. The eye, now no more than a coal, dimmed further, shrinking into itself like a star collapsing into a memory. And with its waning, the light that had suffused the heights of Barad-dûr began to recede. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, not growing darker but more transparent, as if the darkness itself were losing substance, as if the very concept of fear had grown thin and unsure, no longer able to bind itself to the stones. And all at once the air shifted, not in temperature, but in essence. The wind that tore through the summit no longer screamed. It sighed. It no longer clawed at the skin, but brushed it, tender, almost mournful, as though it too understood that this was not just the end of a structure, but of a vision, a dream wrought in the forge of despair. And in that moment of trembling stillness, the lieutenant knelt, not as a supplicant, not as a vanquished slave, but as a witness. He pressed his forehead to the cracked stone floor and closed his eyes, breathing in the dust of ages, feeling it coat his lungs like the words of oaths once spoken and now turned to ash. He was weeping, though not with sobs or gasps, but with a quiet release, tears sliding down his cheeks as slowly as the fall of snow in a forest untouched by feet, each one heavy with all the names he had forgotten, all the lies he had unmade, all the truths he had buried beneath the crushing weight of necessity. "I once believed," he whispered, and the words spilled into the air like incense, curling and fading. That to rise was to escape, that to build high was to be safe from decay. I see now that height cannot lift you beyond your heart. You carry your hollowness with you, no matter how many steps you take, and the higher the tower, the deeper the void it must cast behind it. And the tower listened, for the stones of Barad-dûr had never been deaf, only bound. And now they groaned again, not in protest, but in release, as if they too had been waiting for someone to speak the words that would unchain them from their silence. Below, the cracks spread like veins of light through the black skin of the fortress. Corridors split apart with long, yawning sighs, and towers leaned like tired sentinels too long at their post. The forges, once filled with a song of hammers and the roar of furnaces, flickered and died, their flames collapsing inward like old lungs drawing their final breath. The gates, vast and jagged, trembled upon their hinges, and beyond them the hosts of the west paused in stunned silence. For they could feel it too, that shift, that solemn unraveling. They could see the dust rising like mist, curling skyward in long, elegant spirals. And they knew, not with certainty, but with that instinct older than speech, that something had changed, that the shadow had been pierced, not by blade or siege, but by some quieter, more potent force. Aragorn, standing beneath the banner of Elendil, turned his face to the wind and closed his eyes. And in that wind he heard a sound that was not the roar of victory, but the soft hum of history turning its page. Beside him Gandalf bowed his head, not in triumph, but in respect. For he had long known that towers do not fall simply because they are struck, but because their foundations remember a time before they were corrupted. And Frodo, far away within the fire-choked lungs of Mount Doom, stood upon the edge of his own abyss, his soul torn between ruin and redemption, unaware that at the summit of the enemy's tower a man was kneeling, not to beg forgiveness, but to remember how it felt to be human. The lieutenant stood once more, and as he did, the floor beneath him split wide. Not a fall, but an opening, a mouth, yawning to speak one final word. He stepped forward, and the wind rose around him in a spiral, lifting the ash and dust into a slow dance that swirled upward into the black heavens. He walked to the edge of the summit and looked out across the land, at the fields broken and blasted, at the armies waiting below, at the dim glow of the mountain that still throbbed with ancient fire. And he opened his arms. "No more," he said. "No more masks, no more chains. Let the earth remember me not as I was, but as I chose to be in this last hour." And with that, the ground gave way, not violently, not cruelly, but like a breath released at last, and the summit of Barad-dûr began to collapse, not in flames and screams, but in silence, in reverence, as if the stones themselves bowed low before the return of truth. The wind howled once more, high and long and sorrowful, and then the tower fell. And the tower at last gave in, not with an explosion, not with a thunder of fury long withheld, but with a long, exhaling sigh that seemed to travel not only through stone and steel, but through memory and shadow and silence itself, as though the weight of all the centuries born in defiance of light had finally become too much, and the very bones of Barad-dûr, blackened by pride and hardened by endless purpose, had at last accepted the inevitability of surrender. The ground groaned with a deep, reluctant ache, as if the earth beneath had grown weary of supporting something so poisoned by ambition. And the sky, ever choked with smoke, parted just slightly, barely a breath, just enough for the starlight, so long banished, to spill through in faint ribbons, brushing across the jagged peaks and shattered gates, with the gentleness of a mother waking her child after a long, troubled sleep. From afar, the captains of the West watched, their hearts clenched not with jubilation, but with a kind of mournful awe. For what they beheld was not the destruction of a fortress alone, but the death of an era, the unraveling of a wound that had scarred the world for longer than most of them had drawn breath. And as the tower fell, it did not scream. It did not rage. It did not call down curses or beg for salvation. It simply folded inward, the topmost spire tilting as though it bowed to the dawn, and then crumbling, stone upon stone, like the slow falling of a house of cards built upon forgetting. Dust rose in spirals, not in violence, but in reverent ascent, and from that dust came no cries, only the sound of breaking, a slow, aching rupture, like the heart of the world unlearning pain. Aragorn did not speak, but the sword at his side seemed to grow lighter, as though it too recognized that its task, long inherited, had drawn near to its end. His eyes, gray and deep, as the sea that once bore Númenórean ships across starlit waters, turned toward the west, toward the lands they would rebuild, and his breath came slow and steady, not as a warrior rejoicing in victory, but as a man beholding the full cost of a wound finally closed. Beside him, Gandalf stood motionless, his staff rooted in the scorched ground, his eyes not on the tower, but on the horizon, where the winds from Mount Doom curled upward in fiery eddies. His face bore no smile, only a deep weariness, a sorrow held not for the enemy, but for the long chain of choices that had brought the world to this threshold. "These stones," he murmured so softly that only the wind seemed to answer. "They do not fall easily. They are not simply brick and mortar, but thoughts given shape, will hardened into structure. To see them fall is to see a mind unravel, to see the soul of a dark age breathe its last." Legolas, watching the tower disappear into its own smoke, spoke without taking his eyes from the ruin. "It is strange," he said, "how the air changes even before the light does. I feel it as one feels the shift before a storm. But this is not the coming of rain. It is the breath of something new, something fragile." And Gimli, his brow furrowed beneath his helm, nodded slowly. "There is no cheer in this. Only the kind of quiet that comes after a fire has burned down a house. You're glad the flames are gone, but what's left behind is still ashes." And Frodo, though far from this sight, felt it in his bones. As he clung to the edge of the chasm in Mount Doom, his strength failing, the ring's final cry still ringing in his ears like a curse and a prayer woven together. He felt it, that distant collapse, the surrender of the dark tower, and he knew with a certainty that needed no vision that the burden he had carried had at last broken something greater than itself. And in that knowledge, his eyes closed, and he fell, not into despair, but into the arms of a friend whose loyalty had never faltered, whose hands reached into fire not to seize glory, but to save a soul. And still the tower fell. Its stones struck the plain, not with wrath, but with the dignity of old kings falling to their knees. The walls buckled in slow waves. The gates twisted like the last grimace of a forgotten statue, and the fire that had once run like blood through its veins now sputtered out, leaving only rivulets of smoke and molten glass. And from the summit, from where the lieutenant had stood, no body fell. There was no corpse, no remnant, only the whisper of wind and the last glimmer of his presence, as though he had passed not into death, but into the story itself, dissolved into the memory of redemption. his name no longer needed, for the choice he made now sang louder than any title, and the land began to change. The skies, once thick with the soot of 1,000 forges, began to clear as if the very breath of the world had shifted direction, inhaling again after centuries of choking. The clouds parted slowly, as if uncertain whether they had the right to reveal the stars again. And when they did, the light was not sudden, not triumphant, but tender, gentle, the light of healing, not of conquest. It spilled across the ruined plains, brushing the cheeks of soldiers who lowered their blades not with shouts, but with tears. And it crept even into the hidden places, the valleys long forgotten, the corners of the heart untouched by song. And it began to bloom there, slow as moss, but sure as sunrise. And the wind carried a new sound, not of drums, not of horns, but of silence made sacred. The silence of a world that has remembered how to listen. And in the aftermath, as the dust of Barad-dûr fell slowly like the ashes of an extinguished star, settling not only upon the blasted earth of Gorgoth, but also into the crevices of memory and the deep hollows of every soul that had borne witness to the fall. The silence that followed was unlike any silence known to war or peace. It was a silence that trembled with meaning, a silence that had texture like the velvet stillness of snowfall over a battlefield where nothing more can be taken or lost. The sky above, no longer choked with black flame or lit by the cruel glow of a sleepless eye, revealed its ancient, veiled beauty. Stars flickering cautiously into view, like survivors peering from behind ruined walls, hesitant but longing to shine again after long exile. And the plains, once hardened into glass by unholy fire, seemed to exhale as if they too had been holding their breath through ages of shadow. Their surface cracked and smoking, but no longer dead. No longer silent in the way despair is silent, but hushed in the way a cathedral is quiet after the last hymn is faded. The hosts of the west did not advance. They stood still, their banners fluttering weakly in the wind that now came not as a harbinger of fire or sulfur, but as a messenger of change, its breath cool and strangely sweet, carrying the scent not of blood or burnt stone, but of something older and softer, the faint perfume of water on dry soil, the aroma of green things imagined but not yet born. And in that wind there was a voice, not words, not a command or song, but the kind of voice the world uses when it wishes to be understood, not through speech, but through sensation. It said, "Wait." And they did. For though the tower had fallen, though the eye had dimmed, and the ring had perished in the fires that gave it birth, the earth had not yet stilled, and there was something in the tremor beneath their feet. Not the terror of wrath, but the ripple of something unfolded. High King Elisar, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir to the lost kings of Númenórean, stood at the front of his host. Andal sheathed now, for he felt no need to draw it, not in triumph, not in fear, but in the knowledge that the time for swords had passed, and the time for silence, for reverence, had come. His hand, roughened by war, but still steady, rested lightly upon the hilt, not in readiness, but in memory. And his gaze, clear and far-seeing, rested not on the ruin, but on the horizon, where the first faint blush of true dawn began to stain the clouds with the colors of a world reborn. He did not speak at first, and those around him did not press him to, but when at last he did, his voice was soft, almost private, as though he spoke not to his captains, or even to his people, but to the wind, to the land, and perhaps to the man who had once stood atop the dark tower and chosen to become more than what the shadow had shaped him to be. "There is a difference," he said slowly, "between victory and healing. A sword may silence a voice, but it cannot erase the echo. A tower may fall, but the shadow it cast lingers until the world is ready to remember not what it feared, but what it endured. We do not stand here to conquer. We stand here to understand what it meant to resist. Not only the enemy, but the temptation within ourselves to become like him." Gandalf stepped forward then, the white of his robes dulled by ash, but his presence undiminished, and he looked not to the east, but down toward the places beneath the mountain, where Samwise carried Frodo like a broken vessel, up the last cruel slopes, where fire and fate had entwined, not in glory, but in sacrifice. His voice, when it came, was almost as soft as Aragorn's, but older, so much older, as though it had traveled from before the first song, from the very breath of Ilúvatar hymn. "There are moments," he said, "when the world must be rewritten, not by kings or warriors, but by those who bear weight without title, whose strength lies not in the hand, but in the heart. Frodo, Sam, those little ones have done what no army could do. They walked into the very mouth of despair, and returned not with conquest, but with release. And perhaps," he added, turning his eyes skyward, "that is the deepest magic of all. Not the power to command, but the will to relinquish." Behind them, the soldiers of Gondor and Rohan stood in solemn stillness. Éomer, high upon his steed, lowered his helm and closed his eyes, thinking not of the road ahead, but of the riders who had fallen along the way, their names etched not in marble, but in the breathless memory of the land. Legal turned his face to the wind and listened with the keen ears of his people, and heard, faint and pure, the beginning of a bird song, distant but real, a note of music in a land that had not heard such tones in many lifetimes. Gimli stood beside him, arms crossed, and said nothing, but a tear ran down his weathered cheek and vanished into his beard, and he did not wipe it away. And far away in the quiet fields beyond the Anduin, a child looked up into the morning sky and saw the stars fade into dawn. And though she did not understand why, she began to hum a tune her grandmother used to sing, a lullaby about the sea and ships with sails like silver leaves, and a land where the trees never died and the wind always whispered the names of those who were lost but not forgotten. And so the siege ended, not with fire, not with a last desperate charge, not with a cry of victory or the tolling of war bells, but with stillness and breath, and the first light of morning reaching across the broken stones of Mordor, like the hand of the world itself, had come to mend what had been torn. And so, in the end, what remained was not ruin, not ash, not even the echo of a fallen name, but a stillness so deep, so encompassing, that it felt as though the world itself had drawn a breath and held it just for a moment. To honor the gravity of what had passed, the last stones of Barad-dûr, now half buried beneath the weight of their own silence, no longer stood in defiance, but in surrender, like a colossus kneeling in the dust, humbled not by war, but by memory, by the long and patient working of time. And in that dusk-laden air, where once the cries of orcs and the howl of fell beasts had filled the sky like a storm of broken glass, now there was only the sound of wind moving slowly, carefully, as if unwilling to disturb the sanctity of a wound that had finally begun to heal. Across the plains, beneath the slow, spreading light of dawn, the land began to uncoil from its long tension. The ground, once hardened into blackened plates of molten grief, softened beneath the rising sun, and small fissures formed not as scars, but as invitations, openings through which rain might fall, roots might dig, and green things, timid at first, might stretch forth again. The air, once choked and lifeless, began to shimmer with something unfamiliar. Clarity. It was as though the very fabric of the land had remembered its own gentleness and was now trying to teach itself how to breathe again, one trembling gust at a time. And in that quiet hour, Aragorn walked among the soldiers of the West, not as a king seeking glory, but as a man carrying the weight of many endings. His steps were slow, his eyes turned not upward, but toward the faces of those around him, faces marked by fatigue, by the gray ash of battle, but also by something deeper, something softer. For within those wearied expressions he saw the spark of relief, not born from triumph, but from the realization that they had survived not just the battle, but the darkness it had cast over their souls. He paused beside a young soldier who had knelt in the dirt, his sword laid flat before him like an offering. The boy looked up at Aragorn, and though his lips trembled, he did not speak. "You did not fail," Aragorn said gently, and his voice was not that of command, but of companionship, of shared sorrow. To endure is not failure. To bear witness, to carry the memory of this place so that others do not have to. That too is a kind of strength, perhaps the greatest kind. The soldier nodded, a single tear slipping down his cheek, and bowed his head, not to a king, but to the world as it was now, changed, quiet, unfinished. And in the east, beyond the smoldering hills, where Mount Doom still sighed in slow, reluctant plumes, the ground began to shift, not with fury, but with release. The great mountain, which had once roared like a forge of wrath, now seemed tired, spent, and the fire within it no longer bellowed, but flickered, as though the spirit that had kept it alight had departed with a ring's final plunge. The sky above it opened at last, revealing a tender blue, so pale it was almost silver. And in that light, Frodo awoke. He lay cradled in Sam's arms, his body frail, his eyes sunken, but his spirit somehow intact. Sam held him tightly, as though afraid that if he loosened his grip, Frodo might vanish like a shadow at sunrise. "You did it, Mr. Frodo," Sam whispered, and though his voice shook with exhaustion, it carried the unwavering clarity of truth. "You did it. It's over." But Frodo, after a long pause, only whispered, "Yes, Sam, it's over. But I wonder if I have come too far to go back." Sam did not answer at first. He looked at the sky, at the smoke rising from the ruined mountain, and then at the land stretching out before them, scarred but vast, ruined but waiting. "Maybe," Sam said at last, his voice raw with love and grief, "maybe you can't go back to what was, Mr. Frodo. But maybe you can go forward into something new. Maybe we all can. And somewhere beneath the earth, deeper than any forge or tomb, something shifted, a chain undone, a whisper stilled, a door closed at last." The days that followed were filled not with ceremony, but with care. The soldiers turned from battle to tending, mending what could be mended, burying what had fallen, singing softly not songs of victory, but laments for the world that had been, and lullabies for the one yet to come. And when at last they turned their feet westward again, it was not as warriors returning from conquest, but as pilgrims bearing seeds of peace scattered across their shoulders like the dust of spring. And Barad-dûr, or what remained of it, did not rise again. It did not whisper promises, nor did it lure the lost. It stayed broken, as all great lies must, when truth has passed through. And in time the vines would come, and the birds, and perhaps if the wind was kind, even laughter. And so the siege was ended, and the shadow passed, and the world, breath by